The dust was already hanging in the air that morning, so thick it tasted like grit on the tongue. It mixed with the heat, the sweat, and the sour smell of thousands of men who had been marching for weeks, step after step, across a land that did not welcome them. Behind them was hunger and exhaustion. Around them were fast-moving Turkish riders who never seemed to sleep. Ahead of them stood Iconium, a fortified city that looked like a locked gate on the road to Syria for most armies. This would have been the moment when courage turned into desperation. And yet, within hours, the impossible would happen. To understand why, we have to rewind a few weeks to the moment Frederick Barbarossa chose the hardest path on the map. In May 1119, during the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus sailed by sea. Barbarossa did not. At 68, the Holy Roman Emperor chose to lead his army overland through Anatolia, a route that had swallowed other crusading forces before him. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. If you enjoy calm, story-driven history that focuses on strategy, character, and the human choices behind famous battles, consider liking this video and subscribing. Today we are walking the road of the German crusaders as they crossed the Anatolian plateau, where the sun punished every mistake and water was never guaranteed. We will see how an aging emperor kept discipline when fatigue was breaking bodies and patience was breaking tempers. We will also meet his opponent, Sultan Kilij Arslan Tekin, a ruler who understood the Turkish style of war speed, distance, and constant pressure. This episode is the story of the Battle of Iconium, when a battered crusader army refused to collapse and instead struck with surprising boldness, not because they were comfortable, but because they were cornered. And sometimes that is when leaders make their clearest decisions. Barbarossa had survived 4 decades of hard politics and harder campaigning by noticing what others overlooked. His officers saw Turkish strength and heard the whistle of arrows, and thought only of defense. Barbarossa watched patterns. The Seljuks relied on movement, on keeping enemies tired and off balance, and on avoiding close, organized clashes with heavy cavalry. Their confidence had started to harden into routine. They believed no Western army could endure the furnace of Anatolia long enough to reach Iconium with order intact. But Barbarossa kept his men moving, kept their ranks tight, and kept their spirits from unraveling. The march had reduced his forces dramatically, not because the emperor was careless, but because the land itself demanded a price. Water was scarce. Food was limited. Horses weakened. Men fell behind. Turkish harassment and night alarms drained sleep. Still, he pressed forward, convinced that the Seljuks were betting on a slow collapse. His answer was simple: do not give them the collapse they expect. Iconium, modern Konya, was more than a city. It was the center of Seljuk authority in Anatolia, a symbol as much as a stronghold. Its walls were layered and well-maintained, its gates guarded, its streets stocked with supplies that an army on the move could only dream of. It also sat on routes that mattered. If Barbarossa could secure passage through this region, he could keep the overland crusade alive and continue toward the Holy Land. Sultan Kilij Arslan believed he had time. He did not need to rush into a single, decisive clash. The Turkish plan was to shadow the crusaders, keep them thirsty, keep them nervous, and then strike when they were too weak to respond. It was a plan that had worked before, and it had made Anatolia a dangerous place for armies that depended on heavy armor and steady supply. By mid-May, word reached Barbarossa that the Sultan's main field force was closing in. The Crusaders were now squeezed between Iconium and an approaching army that could outnumber them several times over. Most medieval commanders would have chosen either retreat or a defensive camp and prayer. Barbarossa chose something else. He chose to attack, not in a reckless way, but in a way designed to break the Seljuks' expectations. He understood that the Turks expected Western soldiers to wait for a siege and slowly weaken. They did not expect a tired force to move with purpose toward the city and at the same time prepare for a field engagement. Barbarossa had spent weeks watching how Turkish riders behaved, when they pressed close, when they pulled back, and what happened when they believed victory was already decided. At dawn, Barbarossa counted what he could truly use. The numbers were far below the early claims of 100,000. Only a fraction remained battle-ready, yet what he had left was hardened. He still had a corps of armored knights with war horses, and he had infantry who had been trained to keep formation even under constant harassment. In the Crusader camp, names mattered. Duke Frederick VI of Swabia, the Emperor's son, led key elements of the vanguard. Experienced nobles commanded regional contingents and maintained order. The Emperor's household troops formed a disciplined center. Men who had campaigned with him for years and understood his signals. Against them were Iconium's garrison and the Sultan's field army, including large numbers of cavalry archers whose speed and flexibility were the pride of Seljuk warfare. On paper, the odds favored the Sultan. Barbarossa's advantage was that he was not thinking on paper. He was thinking in timing, terrain, and psychology. The Emperor's plan looked risky, even reckless, and some of his closest advisors argued against it. He divided his forces. Duke Frederick would take a smaller column toward Iconium, creating immediate pressure on the city and tempting the defenders to react. Barbarossa would take the larger body and position it to meet the Sultan's approaching army. Splitting a force when outnumbered seems like a mistake, and it can be, but Barbarossa was not splitting his army to fight two separate wars. He was trying to pull the Seljuk response apart, to force them to make decisions quickly, and to keep them from using their favorite advantage time. If the Turks could keep the Crusaders waiting and thirsting, the outcome was predictable. If the Crusaders moved decisively, the Seljuks would have to improvise. And improvisation is uncomfortable even for talented commanders. That evening, anxiety moved through the camp like a cold wind. Turkish riders circled at a distance, calling insults, showing captured items, and trying to turn fatigue into panic. Some men wanted to believe the city would never open, that the walls would hold, that the next day would be only more arrows and more marching. Barbarossa answered that mood not with speeches, but with presence. He moved among the ranks, visible, steady, and calm. He did not promise an easy day. He promised clarity, a single hard push that could win supplies and space. Priests held mass. Knights confessed, not only because they feared death, but because they wanted to face the next morning with a clean conscience. Infantry checked straps, shields, and spear points, and tried to sleep in short bursts. Barbarossa also kept one element in reserve, the kind of detail that separates a bold plan from a foolish one. His best household cavalry, well armed and still mounted on the strongest remaining horses, were held back to strike at the right moment. In medieval battle, the timing of a heavy charge could decide everything. Release it too early and it burns out. Hold it too long and your infantry is broken before it arrives. Barbarossa's experience taught him to treat cavalry like a hammer, not a decoration. On the pre-dawn of May 18, 1190, the Crusader force moved in two columns, quiet and purposeful. Duke Frederick went toward Iconium's gates, while Barbarossa took position on ground that would favor a controlled, downhill strike if the Turks pressed too close. He was setting a stage, and he needed his opponent to walk into it. As the sun rose, Turkish cavalry archers began their familiar work. They swept forward in loose formations, loosed arrows, and rode away before a slow opponent could catch them. It was not just physical pressure, it was mental. The constant whir of arrows, the need to keep shields up, the uncertainty of where the next strike would land. All of it eroded focus. But the Crusaders had been living inside this storm for weeks. They had learned to respond with disciplined shields overlapping, ranks tightening, men stepping into gaps without breaking formation. Barbarossa's line bent, but it did not dissolve. That mattered. Seljuk tactics were designed to turn order into disorder, because once a formation breaks, fast cavalry can pick it apart. Barbarossa's first victory that morning was simply keeping his army from panicking. Near the city, Duke Frederick approached Iconium in open view. The defenders faced a choice. A small crusader column could not knock down triple walls in a single morning, but letting them linger near the gates was risky. Pride and confidence also played their part. The Seljuks had been telling themselves that these crusaders were nearly finished. When the gates opened and a body of defenders moved out to meet Duke Frederick, it was meant to be an easy push, a show of superiority. Instead, they met organized resistance. Crusader infantry formed tight groups with spears, and the few crossbowmen who remained aimed carefully at horses and leaders. Duke Frederick held his knights back, waiting for the moment when the defenders were close enough and committed enough that they could not simply ride away. Back on the plain, the Sultan's main army arrived with drums, banners, and a visible confidence. Dust rose behind their approach like a moving wall. To Seljuk eyes, Barbarossa's position looked like a tired force preparing for a last stand. That was exactly the picture Barbarossa wanted to paint. He wanted the Turks to press in close, to crowd forward, to believe that the western line was about to crack. The more tightly the Turkish riders gathered for the final push, the less room they would have to maneuver when a heavy cavalry reserve suddenly appeared. And when news reached the Sultan that fighting had begun outside Iconium and that the gates were open, he faced a decision. He could divert forces to protect the city or finish the field, fight quickly. Convinced his numbers guaranteed a swift outcome, he chose speed. He believed he could win in the open and then deal with the city. That belief was the hinge of the day. Around midday, the battle shifted from harassment to decision. Turkish riders pressed closer, sensing fatigue and looking for breaks in the line. Crusader losses were real. Men had been marching and fighting on short rations. and every hit landed harder because bodies were already worn down. Yet the line held. Barbarossa waited, and waiting in a battle takes nerve. It is easier to act than to hold back. But he had planned this moment. He had placed his infantry to absorb pressure, not to chase. He had placed his visible cavalry on the wings to look vulnerable, drawing Turkish attention outward. And he had kept his strongest mounted men hidden behind the center, ready to move through an opening like water through a gate. At the same time, outside Iconium, Duke Frederick launched his own moment. When the garrison cavalry found themselves slowed and boxed by infantry resistance, he released his knights in a concentrated strike. The effect was immediate. Heavy cavalry, when it hits at the right time, is not just a physical impact, it is a moral shock. Light cavalry expects room. It expects the chance to ride off and return. When that room disappears, confidence can turn into confusion. Duke Frederick's attack pushed the defenders back toward the gate area, and Crusader foot soldiers surged toward the entrance, sensing that a door had been left open. In street fighting, numbers matter less than momentum. A few determined groups can create a cascade if defenders hesitate. The defenders tried to regroup, but the very structure of the city, with narrow streets and crowded spaces, made fast response difficult. On the plain, Barbarossa gave the signal, trumpets sounded, and the Crusader center shifted. His reserve cavalry emerged, not scattered, but organized into a tight, forward-pointing formation designed to punch through the densest part of the enemy. The Turks had pressed in for the finish. That closeness, which felt like victory a moment earlier, now became a problem. Cavalry archers need space to turn. They need distance to shoot and withdraw. When a heavy cavalry formation comes at them quickly, with discipline and weight, the entire geometry of the fight changes. Barbarossa's charge did not depend on chasing fast riders across open ground. It depended on striking where the Turks had crowded themselves, turning their eagerness into vulnerability. In that instant, the old emperor was not trying to outnumber the Sultan. He was trying to outthink him. The main clash did not end in a single blow, but the direction of the day changed sharply. The Crusader charge forced Turkish units to scatter and created openings for infantry to advance. The Seljuk army was skilled, and many commanders tried to restore order. But restoring order under pressure is far harder than maintaining it. Once a formation starts to peel away, fear spreads fast. Some Turkish riders tried to regroup at a distance and resume archery. Others pulled back towards safer ground. Barbarossa pressed forward, just enough to keep the Turks off balance, but not so far that he lost control. This is an important point for understanding his leadership. He was not simply charging in anger. He was managing risk, making sure his men did not chase too far and get isolated. The classic danger when heavy cavalry becomes separated from infantry support. Accounts from the Crusader side describe the moment as a release of weeks of tension. Men who had been protecting themselves with shields now felt the chance to move forward. Infantry, when it senses cavalry success, often becomes braver because it believes the field is opening. The Crusader foot soldiers surged, not as a wild mob, but in organized groups following banners and familiar leaders. That organization mattered. It meant the Turks could not simply circle and pick off stragglers as they had done on the march. Barbarossa's officers kept directing men into lines, toward key points, and away from pointless pursuit. Meanwhile, The Sultan, watching his plan slip, realized he had underestimated what Western discipline could do when it was used deliberately and not worn down over days of delay. By mid-afternoon, the fighting near Iconium and the fighting on the plain began to intersect in a way the Seljuks had not expected. Duke Frederick's pressure near the gates, combined with the Sultan's difficulty restoring control in the field, created confusion about where the main threat truly was. Some defenders tried to rush back toward the city. Others tried to hold the field. The Crusaders benefited from this divided attention. They did not need to destroy every enemy unit. They needed space, water, and supplies. They needed to break the immediate trap. Barbarossa's greatest success that day was forcing the Seljuks to react to him rather than controlling the rhythm of the fight. A commander who wins the rhythm often wins the outcome. And on May 18, Barbarossa seized the rhythm with bold timing. Inside Iconium, the city did not fall like a storybook fortress collapsing in an instant. It fell the way many medieval cities fell when defenders were surprised and momentum shifted through confusion. Rushed decisions, and the sudden realization that gates and streets were now being contested. Some civilians fled to safer quarters. Some defenders pulled back toward stronger positions. In the chaos, Crusaders found what they had been desperate for: water, food, and rest. For an army that had been rationing and suffering, the capture of supplies was not a luxury. It was survival. Barbarossa was disciplined enough to order guards posted and key points secured, because he understood that a city taken without control can quickly become a trap. Even in victory, his mind stayed on the road ahead. The Sultan, facing the loss of control and the risk of further damage to his authority, moved toward negotiation. This is often how medieval campaigns ended after a sharp, costly day, not with total destruction, but with practical agreements. Khalij Arslan offered provisions, guides, and safe conduct, along with payments and hostages to guarantee the promises. Barbarossa accepted not because he feared continuing the fight, but because he understood his strategic goal. He did not come to Anatolia to rule Iconium. He came to move through Anatolia and reach the Holy Land. The battle had opened the route, broken the immediate pressure, and restored his army's ability to continue. For the Crusaders, it felt like a breath after nearly drowning. There was also a human moment that later writers remembered: the meeting of father and son after the crisis. Duke Frederick had carried a heavy share of risk, and Barbarossa, after decades of command, knew what it meant to watch a son lead men under real danger. They embraced among the aftermath, not as performers, but as a family that had survived a day that could easily have ended differently. The army, for the first time in weeks, had a sense of stability. Men ate, tended wounds, repaired gear, and allowed themselves to believe they might actually reach Syria. The psychological shift was enormous. Turkish writers who had treated the Crusaders like prey now had to treat them like a force capable of sudden, organized violence. That change in perception matters in warfare. It affects how enemies shadow you, how quickly they commit, and whether they think twice before pressing too close. Iconium became Barbarossa's last great battlefield success, and it deserves its reputation not because it was the largest fight of the age, but because it was a triumph of judgment under pressure. He did not win simply by charging. He won by understanding what his opponent expected and then refusing to play that script. He used timing, terrain, and discipline to turn a desperate situation into an opportunity. The lesson that echoed through later medieval warfare was clear. Heavy cavalry is most effective when it is controlled, concentrated, and released at the decisive moment, not when it is wasted in scattered pursuits. Barbarossa also demonstrated something older than any tactic, the effect of leadership on endurance. A tired army can still fight if it believes its commander sees a path forward. And then comes the tragic irony that makes history feel almost cruel in its timing. On June 10, only weeks after Iconium, Frederick Barbarossa died crossing the Seljuk River in Cilicia. The details vary in the telling, but the outcome is certain. The emperor, who had survived decades of war and politics, was gone. His death did not erase the victory at Iconium, but it changed what that victory could produce. Without Barbarossa's authority holding the German force together, the overland crusade weakened. Some men continued. Some turned back. And the momentum of the campaign shifted toward the leaders who arrived by sea. Richard the Lionheart would still gain fame, and the crusade would still shape legends. But the particular weight that Barbarossa could have brought to the Holy Land never fully arrived. So what does Iconium ultimately mean? It is a reminder that outcomes are not always decided by numbers alone. They are decided by choices, by discipline, and by the ability to act clearly when everyone else feels trapped. Barbarossa's march through Anatolia was a test of organization as much as courage. Iconium was the moment when that organization paid off. The ruins of old Konya cannot replay the sound of hooves or the shouts of men, but the lesson remains visible in the shape of the story pressure can be endured. Patterns can be broken. And a commander who thinks beyond the obvious can change the direction of a campaign in a single day. If you want more episodes that explore the human side of strategy and leadership in medieval history, like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. The Redbeard's legend did not end in a palace or on a throne. It ended on the road, with an exhausted army that proved it still had one bold move left.